Exploring along foreign shores, sailing great longships festooned with shields and swords, returning to huge feasts seated around long tables, merrily drinking from animal horns and cheering skol. The popular image of the Viking is of a rogue, a burly axe-wielding, long-haired and bearded heavy-drinking warrior. Perhaps this sounds enticing. Unfortunately, the reality was much different. Today we look at why you wouldn't last 24 hours in the Viking Ages. Welcome to the Viking Vault. Northmen. Northmen, Rus, Raiders, Lochlaniac, Danes, Dubgale and Fingale, Norsemen, Ascomani and Almajos, lasting from roughly 793 to 1066 CE. These names were whispered fearfully throughout the whole of Europe, in Britain, Ireland, Wales, France, Germany, and perhaps even America. These were the localized, frightening, and often mythical names conjured up by the unfortunate victims who had experienced an encounter with Vikings, Scandinavian in origin, hailing from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The earliest recorded Viking raid on the British Isles took place in June 793 at Lindisfarne, where a force of these heathen raiders hacked, butchered, and slaughtered the unarmed Christian monks who resided in the island's monastery. They looted whatever valuables and commodities they could find before taking a number of monks as slaves. Scholar and theologian Alcuin of York, in a letter to Ethelred, the King of Northumbria, horrifyingly recounts the raid as, quote, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Behold the church of St. Cuthbert, Lindisfarne Monastery, spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. A place more vulnerable than all in Britain is given as a prey to pagan peoples." The massacre at Lindisfarne set the precedent for a flood of Viking raids targeting other coastal monasteries, towns, and small settlements in the British Isles as well as Western Europe. Once they expanded their attacks to France, they even raided Paris in 845, and occasional raids ventured as far as Spain and Portugal. Utilizing the maze of rivers and waterways that snaked through Britain, they navigated their longships close into shore to strike hard and fast in hit-and-run raids, plundering religious relics that were invariably gold or silver and striking fear into the rural population. As they grew more confident, these hit-and-run raids gradually transitioned to the establishing of winter camps and temporary settlements, such as their base in Dublin, created in 841. During the Viking Middle Ages, 850 to 950, significant Viking settlements were established all across the British Isles, such as the city of Jorvik, which we now know as York. Some regions introduced Danelaw, where Viking laws and governance dominated all. Around 950 to 1066 is considered the late Viking Age, culminating in the Norman conquest of Britain following their victory at the Battle of Hastings. Viking leaders strengthened their ties with European nobility through strategically significant marriages, even establishing the North Sea Empire, where Viking Canute the Great ruled over England, Denmark, and Norway collectively. With the increasingly powerful spread of Christianity, many Viking leaders adopted the religion and built churches in their settlements for their own people, or at the very least gradually incorporated Christian practices with lingering Norse customs. In sickness and in health. Despite the Vikings being known for their progressive hygiene and sanitation practices, they are, after all, supposed to have been the first to have introduced regular bathing, if you could class once a week as regular. There still existed a dangerous host of maladies, diseases, incurable illnesses, viruses, contagions, ailments, and infections. Vikings rarely reached the ages of 35 to 40, and it was certainly rare if they lived to be over 60. Infant mortality rates were extremely high, however Viking women often lived longer than men, and nutritional deficiencies such as scurvy and rickets would have also been prevalent in all, due to the lack of diverse foods and vitamins and improper dental care or treatment. Skeletal remains show chronic arthritis of the back, hands, and knees was common, a result of their daily physically demanding agricultural work, manual farming practices, and little to no understanding of healthy rest and recuperation. Leprosy, or Hansen's disease as it is known today, was extremely prevalent during the Viking Ages. A contagious bacterium-based disease, leprosy primarily affects the skin, but can also induce nerve damage, muscle weakness, deformities, and even paralysis or blindness in extreme cases. Recent research by the University of Southampton, Queen's University Belfast, and the University of Surrey has suggested that the Vikings actually brought leprosy to Ireland during their travels, introducing the disease into the rural communities where it may have spread and evolved. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, dysentery, dysentery, smallpox, and typhus were also common, and terrifyingly capable of striking down whole armies, as happened to a Viking force camping for the winter at Repton in England in 873 to 874. Discovered in 1979, a mass grave of 264 largely men, women, and children thought to be part of the Great Heathen Army, who ravaged England for close to 10 years, shows that although some skeletal remains displayed evidence of physical wounds, the majority succumbed to mass disease. Living in close proximity to both their livestock and pets in largely unhygienic conditions, especially aboard longship or knars, cargo ships, Vikings would have been largely at risk of disease-transmitting parasites such as ticks, lice, and fleas, rampant in swine and poultry. Echinococcosis, a disease caused by ingesting the eggs of Echinococcus tapeworm, likely contracted from their dogs, is just one gruesome example of the risk facing Vikings with inadequate hygiene, close living conditions, and no great understanding of sanitary food preparation. So, say you are living in the Viking Ages and you contract a deadly infection, a debilitating disease, or even a gory battle wound, you might be wondering how well would you be treated. Would you last 24 hours? Unfortunately, the answer isn't encouraging. Despite the gradual evolution of herbal medicines that were only somewhat effective, magical practices were a standard remedy to a whole host of illnesses and diseases, as were blots. Sacrificial rituals involving the offering of animals, food, or precious items to the gods, namely Thor, Freya, Odin, and Ea, a goddess associated with healing. Runes were popular in invoking prompt healing, physical protection, virtuous health, and to ward off evil. The rune Thurisaz was often for protection, while Uruz symbolized strength and vitality. Guldur were magical incantations or mantras that were believed to have both protective and healing properties. These incantations were usually sung or chanted to invoke the healing powers in a loved one, or likewise to protect them against the evil spirits that Vikings believed were causing illness. Finally, Sedir was a form of Norse magic that was practiced primarily by women, known as vulvas, siresses, but also occasionally by some men. Much like Galdr, it involved rituals, chants, and trances aimed at influencing the future, communicating with spirits, and healing the sick. The vulva would perform rituals to first diagnose the cause of an illness and then seek guidance from the spirits. Valhalla Awaits. Malden, Assendon, Stiklestad, Eddington, Stamford Bridge, just some of the battles best associated with the Vikings, and another disturbing reason you wouldn't last 24 hours in the Viking Ages. On blood-drenched foreign fields, aboard warships packed with warriors on barren icy islands, and in ramshackle town centres against British, Irish, Arabic, French and German foe, fearsome combat and the significant risk of untimely death was all part of Viking life. As young as 12, and sometimes even under 10, male Viking children would start to train in the way of the sword and start their education into the gruesome art of war. As well as the physically toiling daily work required in the farming fields, the boys would regularly wrestle. Enhancing speed, agility, and robustness, they'd train in close combats with wooden weapons, learn to ride horses, and practice archery. Honor played a vital part in the Viking male's upbringing. From an early age, it was instilled in them that no man could change his destiny, and only the brave warrior would make it to Valhalla. A Viking therefore had to fight like a man, and die like a man if the gods had decided it. Once old enough to own real swords and axes, Vikings would treat their weapons with respect, bestowing names upon them such as Legbiter, Vulture's Beak, Blood Axe, Gold Hilt, and Serpent's Tongue. These weapons were not only killing tools, but also a symbol of an individual's wealth and status. Close quarters mortal combat during the Viking Age would have been a sickening, extremely gore-spattered and terrifying experience. Hundreds of people on a battlefield crushed, dragged, and pummeling together in a melee of fighting, close enough to smell the blood, sweat, innards, and urine that signified a horrific fight to the death. Despite having a large circular wooden shield for protection and perhaps wearing mail armor and helmet, the risk of having a sword rammed through your guts, an axe hacking off a limb or two, or a short dagger thrust swiftly through the gullet was an all too real fate. Vikings are most famous for their tactic of forming a shield wall, often depicted in popular culture, where the Norse warriors would line up with shields overlapping in rows 3 or 4 deep and sometimes up to 3 shield lengths high. Archers and spearmen would be positioned behind this defensive formation, firing into the enemy's own position, hoping to maim or kill as many as possible before the close quarters fighting began. From behind their shields, Viking swordsmen could stab and thrust and gouge through the small gaps in the shield wall, low into their opponent's groin and gut, or high into their face or neck. Axemen would deliver crushing blows down onto the enemy's head, caving in even those helmeted heads and splintering shields. To be wounded meant to drop behind, perhaps even to fall down under the boots of fellow Vikings stampeding forward to fight, attempting to stem the flow of blood gushing from your slash, stab, or hack wound, seeping into the earth around you, waiting for that killing blow to fall. Shield Maidens. Despite popular focus aimed at the male Viking warrior, there exists evidence that females too could have been warriors. In a gendered and stereotypical sense, it could seem easy to concoct the belief that a woman's life would have been less dangerous than the male's in the Viking ages. However, historian Leszek Gardila contends that actually, quote, "It is beyond a shadow of a doubt that female warriors were real and existed not only on parchment. Period Norse literature depicts females in various fighting forms, and archaeologists have uncovered burial sites of Viking women buried with weapons, swords, axe heads, spearheads, and arrowheads, the most famous being the Birka chamber grave. Uncovered in Birka, Sweden in 1878, it was only in 2017 that DNA analysis revealed the impressively interred skeleton was actually that of a female buried. Quote, "In a grave full of functional weapons and war gear, and little else, in close proximity to other burials with weapons, next to a building saturated with weapons, outside the gate of a fortress. It was grouped among the 20 richest graves on the site, and interpreted as that of a high-status professional warrior." All of this evidence points to the theory that the woman was indeed a Viking warrior, and judging by the excess of weapons, high-quality clothing, and symbolic gaming pieces, one with considerable status and rank, perhaps even a leader. Sacrifice and slavery. Alongside plundering religious artifacts, valuable commodities, and treasures, Viking raiders regularly kidnapped people, ransoming, exploiting, or selling their captives into slavery. Terrifyingly, quote, "By the mid-9th century, Viking fleets are recorded as taking hundreds and perhaps even thousands of people captive as part of what appear to be well-organized and coordinated raiding ventures." High-status members of the church, as well as noble-born individuals, were prized captives in terms of ransom and short to mid-term exploitation. They were valued more for their prestige than their use as slaves. Perhaps more indicative of the wealth that could be garnered through ransom is a raid on Anglesey, Wales in 987, where a shocking 2,000 captives were taken and then ransomed off more than a penny per head over 2 years. Those captives unlucky enough to be regarded with value were thrust into a variety of roles as slaves to their Viking masters. Menial labor, agricultural work, tending to animals, domestic duties, repairing of arms and armor, if previously a skilled worker, and as concubines or even gifts to fellow tribes. There is evidence that suggests slaves may also have served as human sacrifices, not necessarily in the traditional sense, but in being killed and then buried along with a Viking's loved one or friend, as archaeologists have uncovered in Britain at Ballatir, Repton and Witton, and Ligier and Derby in Denmark. In the latter graves, one high-status male was buried with another man who had been decapitated and buried with his hands and feet tied. The other grave contained the skeleton of a housewife along with a male whose feet had been tied and his neck broken, presumably much the same as Vikings would be buried with their weapons for use in the afterlife. They thought the same was necessary with slaves. So what do you think? Would you last 24 hours in the Viking ages? Let me know in the comment section down below, and please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos. See you next week for another one. Until then, have a fantastic week. Cheers!